You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. John is joined today by Scott Tilley. Scott Tilley is a physicist, amateur astronomer, and satellite tracker best known for rediscovering NASA's long-lost image satellite in 2018. Using open-source tools and homemade equipment, he specializes in detecting zombie satellites, presumed dead spacecraft that unexpectedly resume transmission. His work sheds light on orbital decay, neglected space infrastructure, and the hidden risks and revelations of Earth's forgotten fleet. He shares his discoveries on his blog, Sky Riddles.
Scott Tilley, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Now, Scott, you did something very interesting in amateur astronomy. We have these things that people call zombie satellites, where a satellite, after its lifetime is thought to have ended and that the spacecraft was dead, they suddenly start transmitting again. And there's a short list of these. And one of them is NASA's Image spacecraft, which you rediscovered many years after it went silent in 2005. Tell us the story of that.
Yeah, it started off innocently enough, searching for Zuma, which was that mysterious military launch in January of 2018. And there was all kinds of subterfuge in the media about some kind of launch mishap and that the satellite may have just re-entered almost immediately after launch and not being released from the second stage. A small group of us around the world just kept searching for it just in case there was something more going on, because the satellite would ultimately enter a classified orbit and they wouldn't have published the orbital details. So we started conducting a search, and my search realm was radio. And I started scanning S-band up and down the 100 megahertz that the US military largely uses for downlink, particularly for satellites just after launch. And after a couple of weeks of searching, I came across a signal. It was clearly not in low Earth orbit like we expected Zuma to be, but in high Earth orbit. And I started studying it, and it came back as 26113, which is the NORAD designation number for image. At first, I didn't really clue into what it was. I just thought it was just another high Earth orbit satellite, like I picked up many times before, and added it to my list to review. And I have this habit of anytime I detect a signal, I'll go and just kind of Google it and do a little bit of searching, especially if I haven't recognized it. So I did that with Image later that day, and I came across a failure report that basically said that Image was dead long ago and they had given up on it. From there, I started really diligently going through my data and found that I had plenty of Doppler curves from it from previous passes, and also noticed that there was actually data sidebands indicating that it was still sending telemetry. And that's when I contacted a couple of my colleagues, and they confirmed my observation. And at that point, I kind of sat back and had a discussion with my wife over dinner and said to her, told her about the story. And she just looked at me and he said, "Scott, why don't you tell someone? Why did you tell NASA?" And I said, "Yeah, maybe I should." And dug a little bit deeper, and I found the principal scientist that was responsible for the mission's email address, and I sent him an email. And the next morning, I woke up to a very full inbox, and my phone starting to buzz from the media wanting to know more about what was going on.
Now, for a little background, the Image satellite was a NASA satellite, science satellite, and it mysteriously, for unknown reasons, had some kind of a failure somewhere along the line and just went dead after 5 years of operation. And that was 2005, and it was launched, I believe, in 2000. And that you found it 10 years after, right?
Yeah, that's correct. They never really did figure out exactly what happened to it. And even after we recovered it and they got some more telemetry, they still don't fully understand the failure mechanism. They have ideas, but they really don't understand the failure mechanism. Yeah, that's functionally correct.
And NASA, as you mentioned, did try to bring it back. What was the contact profile? I mean, what did it? Because I know that sometimes it would transmit weakly, and then sometimes it would go strong. What exactly happened there?
So basically, what was going on is that the downlink was really strong. Actually, the issue was with the spacecraft accepting commands from the ground station. So the first problem they had was Image was kind of right on the edge of when they changed from kind of a retro way of communicating with a satellite to the present systems they use. So when Image failed, they kind of decommissioned that hardware shortly thereafter when other related missions with similar communications profiles were phased out. So what they were faced with initially is they didn't have an uplink capability that they could communicate with the satellite. So I was privy to a number of emails from contractors and NASA officials as they literally scrambled around looking through their offices for basically the pieces to rebuild a ground station so they could uplink to it. In fact, one email had in it a comment from an engineer that he'd found a tape drive from Image that had a lot of the software stored on it, and he was using it as a doorstop. So basically, from there, they reconstructed a ground station, and within a week or two of the recovery, they were actually able to send basically what they call a no operation command. So it's the whole intention of it is just to stimulate the satellite to acknowledge a command, but do nothing with it. And that's when they were able to get it to acknowledge, and they were also able to basically download the spacecraft's ID number, and that confirmed that it was actually indeed Image. From there, they found that they were having problems getting the spacecraft to reliably respond to commands. And sometimes it would, sometimes it wouldn't. And that's when they started trying to study various things. And that's where amateurs got involved as well, working with NASA. While we were able to marshal a group of people around the world to monitor Image's passage through eclipse. The reason for that is we wanted to assess the battery health of the spacecraft. So we provided data to NASA as they were trying to get organized to deal with it. Because as you can imagine, there's a bit of bureaucracy there, and scheduling the large antennas and whatnot takes a bit of time. So we provided them some quite useful data right out of the outside of the blocks, and they were able to kind of get an assessment of what the spacecraft was all about before they started really getting into the nitty-gritty of the telemetry.
Now, a question about Zuma, that you were originally looking for that one. Did you ever find it? Did anybody ever find it, or did it indeed actually fail and re-enter the atmosphere?
I guess the most honest answer is there's been no object detected by any amateur that I know of, or any other means that relates to that spacecraft. We would have had enough knowledge, assuming it didn't maneuver on orbit, to identify it. And even if it did maneuver on orbit, there would be a limited number of options of what it could be. So no radio signals were ever heard that I'm aware of, or no optical observations of Zuma were ever obtained, other than one. There was a aircraft pilot that got the second stage fuel venting over Africa. So if the official story is true, that the spacecraft was somehow locked onto the second stage, it couldn't deploy, and they both re-entered and burned up, that would be the last data point that we have.
And that is the key word, really, is that if the official story is true, which regarding secret satellites, of which many are launched by many nations each year, it gets harder and harder to track them all because they keep adding more. Now, what is it like today? Would you be able to pick out Image searching in radio today with so many satellite constellations and everything else out there right now, like Starlink and everything else? Does that confound, I know it does visual astronomy, does that also confound radio listening for satellites?
It doesn't, actually. Doppler is Doppler. So when we detect a spacecraft in orbit, no matter what orbit it is, its Doppler signal or signature is unique to that spacecraft. And the only time it would be identical to another spacecraft, especially if you get multiple curves or passes of it, would be if the two spacecraft were actually docked together or sharing the same space. So it'd be very difficult to not be able to identify a unique spacecraft. And even optically, amateurs continue 24/7 monitoring of low Earth orbit and high Earth orbit for that matter. And we can easily distinguish Starlink missions, and there's a number of classified spacecraft that are equivalent to Starlink called Starshield that are in orbit. And obviously the Starlink and other large constellation satellites are constantly maneuvering, but they're easy to keep track of because they are in these orbital shells and whatnot. So it's relatively easy to differentiate. Where you could maybe have some interesting stuff going on as to what the purpose of a satellite might be if you placed it in say a Starlink-like orbit and made it behave like a Starlink satellite. Now, again, there would be optical characteristics, and there was also amateurs that do track these objects with high magnification telescopes. So we can see what the satellite somewhat looks like. So we can differentiate different types of missions and different buses.
Now, it's no secret that the nation states of the world are very interested in space, especially satellites, for very good reason. Their national security, including my country. And big concern is satellite warfare, almost like a Cold War in low Earth orbit. Do the amateurs see weird interactions between satellites that might indicate some kind of hostile exercise, I guess you would say, between satellites? Because I know they talk about things like mounting circular saws on satellites and things that messing with each other. Do you see evidence of that? Do you see like satellites getting too close to each other for no reason, no known reason?
Amateurs have monitored behaviors of spacecraft on orbit where they're obviously missions that were launched into the same orbital planes as classified missions. A lot of times that observation can be directly out of the actual US government's own data releases through, they publish all of the orbital elements of non-classified objects constantly. And then you can take the amateur catalog and compare them. And then you can see when new launches go up if they're actually in the same orbital plane. An example, I can't remember the name of the keyhole satellite off the top of my head, but there was one of the KH-11s that had a Russian satellite launched into a co-orbital plane, and then the two spacecraft, as the orbits phased each other, would eventually kind of get very close, which could potentially allow for observation and or sending a message to from one nation to another that we can, if we wanted to, approach your spacecraft and do as we please. That's the kind of stuff you can see it in the data, and we can also see it in amateur observations, because the data that we would have collected to know where the US classified surveillance satellite was collected through amateur observations. And the data regarding in the case I just used of the Russian satellite, would have been collected and hosted by the US government itself, and also could be verified by amateur observations. I do see quite a bit of interest from amateurs in monitoring those types of missions. And it's not just happening in low Earth orbit, it's also happening in geo orbit. So there's definitely the possibility of it. Now, do we have any evidence of buzzsaws in orbit or anything like that? No. But we do have certainly observations of spacecraft that were launched into either almost the exact plane of an interesting classified object and did conduct maneuvers and did approach. That is definitely out there in the public domain.
In regards to Russian satellites, do you remember the story of the nested satellite? In other words, they launch a clandestine satellite and it releases what appear to be CubeSats. Do you see that? Do you sometimes see where one day you have a satellite and then the next day or a few days later you have multiple returns around that satellite?
Yeah, it has been published. A lot of times that data gets out into the open through official channels first, and then amateurs may look and confirm. There has been cases where, with similar types of Russian missions, where we have detected radio emissions and actually been able to decode images from those missions, especially some of the earlier satellites within satellite kind of observations. So it's definitely something on the amateur radar. I often monitor in geostationary space after some of the actually in the last 5 or 6 years, the US has launched a number of space tugs into geo orbit, and where they've deployed small satellites, presumably satellite inspectors, and they're in classified orbits, obviously, and then being able to detect them by radio and also optical observation immediately after their deployment and track them and start adding them to the catalog. They constantly change their orbits. They phase themselves so they can either drift east or west to go on different missions, I would presume, or do some kind of broad scope observation from geospace. But I do detect them by radio periodically and generate new orbits, and then focus the optical telescopes on them to generate much more accurate orbits.
Now, one specific orbit that I wonder if you monitor is the Molniya orbit, where a satellite is in very elliptical orbit, and it can appear to hang for a moment. I know this sometimes confounds the radio astronomers looking into SETI, where the satellite will stop and it appears to be a fixed point for a short time, And there you get a radio signal that doesn't normally look like a satellite because there's not much drift. Do you ever monitor those?
Actually, I can tell you an interesting story about exactly that. I had a colleague that used to work at the DRAO, which is the radio astronomy site here in southern British Columbia near Penticton. And they operate an instrument called Chime, which is essentially approximately about 400 megahertz to I think just a little over like 1.5 gigahertz. And what they do is they monitor for sudden radio bursts, fast radio bursts and whatnot, and that's its primary science mission. I got the colleague that I'm referring to was their radio interference officer, and he sent me an email saying, "Hey Scott, we've got this weird emission that seems to be following the sidereal motion periodically. We see it every day, and it gets 4 minutes earlier each day." And he told me the frequency, about 484 megahertz approximately. And I came back immediately and said to him, "Well, you have detected one of the Meridian satellites, and if you guys are phasing your array to happen to be at their apogee points or close to it, that's probably what you're detecting because they operate some narrowband transponders on that frequency." He then sent me actually raw data from the Chime telescope, and I did an analysis for them and came back and helped them identify the signals within the in that particular area of spectrum, so they could then apply filters to it and remove it from their data. So that's the Meridian satellites are in a Molina orbit. They are kind of the replacement to the earlier Molniya spacecraft that were used for telecommunications and also military communications for the Russian military. So they operate a wide spectrum of pun intended transponders from the upper VHF region, UHF, on also on L band and C band and X band. So monitoring those spacecraft are actually quite interesting because it does give you an insight into the posture of the Russian strategic rocket forces and their military in general.
Indeed, it does. Now, the universe loves to produce radio, and what you're doing in radio regarding satellite tracking, do you hear natural sources every so often? I mean, do you hear just bursts of radio? Let's say FRBs. I mean, with what you're doing, do you have that resolution?
Yeah, so a lot of natural radio is much, much weaker than anything man-made, especially in orbit, even out into sci-lunar and deep space. So the instruments amateurs would generally bring to bear, especially on the microwave bands, are not usually sensitive enough to hear anything less than the sun and perhaps some of the strongest radio astronomy sources like Cygnus X1, etc. Yes, I have used those references to calibrate my telescope or my antennas because they are widely monitored and are actually widely used to actually calibrate scientific instruments and also communication systems that that communicate into space. So yes, I have detected them, but they're not. Let's put it this way: it's you have to focus on them, and you have to use different techniques to extract those very, very weak signals, which kind of draws the juxtaposition to satellite signals and how they can interfere with radio astronomy, particularly in certain bands where they just dominate, or the spacecraft produce unintentional emissions through power converters and other things on the spacecraft that can confound radio astronomy.
I believe that, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Cygnus X1 is a black hole and was actually the first identified one. And before that point, they were hypothetical. And there was a suspicion back even into the mid-90s, as I recall, which that dates me, I was there. But they actually found that it was indeed a black hole. I believe probably a solar mass black hole, but still, and that's actually a really powerful radio source.
Yes, yeah, there's a few of them. So generally, as you get lower in frequency, the natural radio noise from space actually gets stronger, and you can start detecting more and more objects, especially in VHF and the low UHF range. But as you go up, their flux densities drop. So even as the instruments they're using have more and more gain, especially in the gigahertz region, when you get above 1 gigahertz, and so it starts becoming more and more difficult to detect natural emissions. Unless, of course, you're listening to the hydrogen lines from our galaxy and external on 1.4 gigahertz, which is pretty loud and easy to detect. But as you move up in frequency, the background noise from space actually decreases in flux. So it becomes more and more difficult to detect it, which can be kind of a bummer when you're trying to calibrate a smaller antenna and stuff like that. But we have the sun, and we can use that quite readily to do the calibration process.
Now, you mentioned the hydrogen in the universe, which, that's 21 centimeters, where you're actually picking up the neutral hydrogen emissions, phase state emissions from the Milky Way. How strong is that? And that also is an area that is set aside by international agreement for radio astronomy so that the astronomers can study that. In fact, the infamous WOW signal was in that territory. Do you ever hear clandestine satellites in that frequency range, or do you even monitor it?
I have monitored it. I have scanned through it, and I haven't detected anything myself. But there is anecdotes in some of the older literature that I've come across in the amateur community that there was a clandestine military usage in that region that did cause some interference to radio science. Now, that reference has long ago disappeared from where I could find it on the web. But yes, I believe it was the US NOS missions that were utilizing that as a downlink, probably as some kind of tactical downlink. NOS is a Naval Observation Surveillance Satellite. That's what we amateurs call it. It's known as Intruder, and it has various other code names that have been released through government, either misadventure or through public releases. It's been going on since the late 1960s, early 1970s, when the first missions were launched and were later under the codename Poppy. And then it became, I believe it was around 1977 when they started launching what is now considered the more modern NOS satellites. And those are the ones that fly in formation. They started off with 3 satellites in a formation. Now they presently use 2. And they constantly emit radio signals, or at least one of the partners does. And we believe that is used for them to actually maintain spacing, etc., and also measure distance between the two of them. So essentially what they're doing is the 2 spacecraft detect a radio signal coming from Earth, whether it's a military radar or ship emissions or something like that, then they triangulate on it. So if you have 2 spacecraft, you can then find the position of that emitting source on Earth. One of the key things would be knowing the distance between the one spacecraft and the other, the leader versus the follower. So that may be the reason why there's always a constant emission from them. Most classified satellites don't readily emit signals constantly unless they're in an early phase of their mission or they're engaged in some kind of orbital maneuver or something like that. So, but just to give you a bit of perspective.
Can you hide a satellite by putting a satellite constellation, a group of them, as you mentioned, into space and have one of them relaying signals back to the main one, which are probably highly encrypted, but you wouldn't know about that other satellite unless you spotted it visually? But if it's a CubeSat like some of today's satellites are, might be kind of hard to spot. Do you think that is a clandestine way to hide your network of spy satellites?
Yes and no. Even if you make the spacecraft small, you might make it a challenge to find optically, but there's a lot of optical sensors now. All you need is the right phase angle and the right glint. So you'd have to get into stealth techniques, which then now complicate the spacecraft more and more and probably cause it to be fairly large. The US did experiment with that decades ago and largely abandoned it due to cost and the fact that everyone they launched, amateurs were able to follow to some degree. So basically, yeah, I think it would be a point of diminishing returns. You could track a satellite by a number of different ways, optically, by radio, radar, and even from space. So there's a lot of missions now that are on orbit in various different orbits that are monitoring space situational awareness. So you would have to, if you were trying to hide the spacecraft in orbit, you would have to make sure that it was invisible to all of those basically detection vectors. And that would greatly complicate the mission in its design. So again, if you're trying to make it really small, you wouldn't probably be able to accomplish all those goals for all those different types of detection threats.
Now, in regards to other zombie satellites, I know that they go back to the 1960s where a battery failed and the circuit just went to open. And we sometimes, the amateurs sometimes hear them. Have you ever looked for any of the others?
Yeah, I have a pretty extensive list of zombie satellites that I've detected over the years. In fact, when you get into monitoring the zombie satellites, you start to get it's almost like doing archaeology in a sense, because you start to see how the radio spectrum was used by various missions and the US military, for example. Initially, because a lot of the earlier ones were experiments to figure out how to build basically the communications and detection networks that they have currently on orbit. And it's actually eerily similar to what we have now. Same communication systems are largely in place still. I'll give you an analogy. I remember visiting a solar observatory in California at Stanford University, and we went into the observatory itself, and this facility had been in operation for decades. And we walked in, and there's this rack of equipment that was dated from the 1970s, and even rotary telephones still on the desks. And I envision that a lot of the communication systems, especially the redundant primary communication systems used by the US military, are largely like that because the facilities have existed for decades. They're known to be very reliable and the infrastructure is in place. And now, obviously, the more advanced communication systems that have evolved, that are probably the primary payload communication systems, are not that. But the basic stuff underneath it, the telemetry and control stuff, is historically dated back to the late 60s, early 70s. And I have direct evidence of this. When you look at the second DSP mission, which is a missile detection satellite, DSP-2, it's still on orbit and it's still emitting radio emissions, even data that corresponds to the SGLS, basically the standard S-band communication scheme that the current DSP satellites that are still on orbit and in operation are still using. And there's various other examples of other early X-band communication satellites that are still emitting TT&C, and they match the profile of current, even the same frequency usage as the current X-band communication satellites that are generations ahead of them. So why would they keep this going for decades like that? And I think it's down to basic redundancy, reliability, and it's something that's been proven to work over the years.
Now, in regards to a specific specific zombie satellite, AMSAT Oscar 7, which was somewhat famously repurposed by the anti-communist Polish sort of resistance in the early 1980s as a communications satellite to contact the West when everybody else mostly thought it was dead. Have you ever tried to look for that one?
Yeah, I hear periodically on 70 centimeters. It doesn't have battery anymore. That was the reason why it failed initially. And then the battery went from a short circuit to an open circuit, and that allowed the solar panels to power its transponder and beacons. From what I understand, based on observation, there's 4 different modes of the spacecraft that it could randomly turn on into. So it's kind of like a little bit of a roulette, which transponder will switch on. But if you know that, you could potentially use it as a communication system, like just as many other amateur satellites that are on orbit now too. So yes, I remember that story. And there's a few other interesting stories where amateurs have carried on dialogues even with astronauts on orbit. That astronaut that was trapped on the Mir space station when the Russian government collapsed, and he was up there for almost a year or more, where he was using amateur radio from the space station to communicate with an amateur in Australia, to just have a pen pal, have somebody human other than mission control to talk to.
Now, these satellites that reactivate, again, open circuit, which means that battery fails. And all of a sudden it comes back, but only when it's in sunlight. In other words, when the sun's hitting its solar panels, you can pick it up. But if it's in Earth's shadow, the umbra or whatever, you can't see anything. And they only periodically wake up. But are they returning usable data? I mean, are you getting telemetry from 1960s satellites that have had their battery failed in this manner?
Yes, actually, back in 2020, I picked out LAS-5. It was launched in 1967. It was an experimental communication satellite. They were experimenting with using UHF, which is now a huge wide spectrum area where the US military and various other militaries use for basically military SATCOM. And they now have a lot of transponders. Russians use it, the United States uses it. So what LAS-5 was doing is it had an experimental transponder and it had a radio beacon. In 2020, I detected the radio beacon and noticed that it was modulated still. It was still sending PSK telemetry. And we started digging through all of the archives online, and we actually found the technical manuals and formal reports from the mission And we found enough information about the spacecraft's emissions and technical data to reverse engineer the actual telemetry, and we're able to start decoding it. And once we started decoding it, we actually decoded it into the telemetry words and frames, and we're able to start studying the various telemetry that we were getting. And we were able to see that a radio frequency experiment was still operational on board. And basically, what that experiment was to listen to a wide range of the UHF radio band, where they were planning on having future military comm satellites, to get a worldwide sense of what radio frequency interference would be occurring there. So what other countries were doing in that spectrum. And that experiment was still running and relaying information. We also were able to reverse engineer quite a bit of the spacecraft's attitude information and also the condition of its power converters and solar panels.
So people are going to ask about the trapped Russians. So back in 1991, during the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there was a cosmonaut, Sergei Krikalev, that got trapped up there. And amateur radio operators were keeping ties with this guy until they could get him back down. Tell us that full story.
I don't have all the details of it, but it was a fascinating, I believe it was a lady in Australia, and she and the cosmonaut, there was a little, like a bulletin board. I remember back in the 80s and 90s when you would call up on your dial-up to a bulletin board service and you could leave like a message, or like you could leave a posting or whatever there, and then somebody else could call up later and respond to you. So essentially that's what was going on. So the Mir space station would pass over the amateur's ground station, and she would download the messages from the cosmonaut, and she would upload her messages to him. And through those messages, they formed a bond, a relationship, essentially. And he got information about what was going on Earth, unfiltered. And she also got to know him and kind of learn more about his feelings about how he was doing up there. So yeah, it was quite a fascinating story. I know it's been written about in a couple of amateur radio journals over the years. But yeah, it goes to speak about the power of amateur communication systems to kind of penetrate through the fog and get into some really interesting geopolitical realms.
And that takes us to the next question, because number one, amateur radio astronomy is indispensable in crises. The amateur radio operators, when you have a hurricane or something like that, that's still important to this day. It used to be more important in the past, but still important as a communication system. But also government transparency, because we're launching all these satellites and they don't tell us what they are. I mean, the U.S. we have an entire tiny space shuttle that they still haven't really told us exactly what it does. So it's important for transparency. What are your views on that?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I disagree with the concept that orbits should be classified. All objects in space should be, and again, that's a UN resolution and treaty. All objects in space, their trajectories should be publicly available. And the primary reason I believe that should be the case is that it cools the temperature geopolitically. When you are mandated, and everybody's mandated to follow the same rules of transparency, any object you launch into space, if the other countries of the world know where it is, have the general intent of what its purpose is, you don't need to be specific. Like if you look at the UN registry that shows space missions, just saying something, this mission is related to the Minister of Defense or something like that, tells everybody in the world what the purpose of the mission is, what the orbit is. So if they want to monitor it, they want to know about it more, they can. And it doesn't create this situation where you have like a raft of missions on orbit that nobody knows where they are. There's no real admission to what their intent and purpose is. So I believe it cools the temperature by sharing that. And we've been seeing, particularly the United States and the West, moving more towards a more open approach. In the first Trump administration, they started to declassify a great number of U.S. military payloads on orbit. Most of them were obvious, that weren't really being hidden, didn't maneuver for whatever reason. The government was classifying their orbits. You can use examples like geostationary communication satellites that never really move unless they're replacing a mission that's failed or been retired. They still haven't declassified the most interesting stuff, like there are high resolution optical surveillance systems in low Earth orbit. There's SAR capabilities, a lot of these new Starshield satellites, and there's a number of other like operational satellites that, like the NOS missions that I spoke of earlier, that they keep classified. I don't see any purpose in it because anybody with a backyard budget can track, identify, and generate orbits for these objects. So if an amateur in their backyard can do it, even the smallest of nation states could do it if they chose.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I mean, it's obviously crucial to global society that it's not illegal to look at the sky. You can collect data on whatever you see, and it's important because you're right, but also added dimension. And you say cooling the temperature, but it also sort of constrains a what would you call it, an arms race in what you can do with satellites. You know what I mean? In other words, nation states could easily go overboard. You could put nuclear weapons in space or something along those lines that threatens everyone. And the amateurs that are watching this would see that and figure it out. And I think that's the really important thing here is, again, as you say, transparency. What brought you to this hobby?
I guess, yeah, what brought me to this hobby? It was kind of just a general interest in space, astronomy, radio, and things technical. I guess when you combine all of that with keeping engineering skills sharp, when you practice in an engineering discipline like I do, having your hobbies kind of help you stay sharp on math and science and stuff like that was really kind of the initial reasoning for it. When I started optically tracking satellites, particularly classified missions and contributing data to their orbits and whatnot, I was influenced by a number of the other observers that did it for what I'll call mild political reasons. There's nobody that's in our groups that are rabid radicals that want to bring down the system and cause disruption. More along the lines of it's kind of a folly to have classified objects in orbit. As you mentioned earlier, like space is kind of like an international park. Nobody owns it. Nobody ever will own it under our present legal realm. And anybody using it should be transparently sharing that information with all other potential users and all other interested parties. And when you do that, you're respecting the fact that space isn't one nation's resource. It's everybody's collective responsibility. And that basically makes every human being responsible for its stewardship.
I don't know if I'd want to go that far. I do not wish to be responsible for the universe. That seems like a lot of work, but still, you're right. And I mean, to a degree, they do. I know that the NSA down here actually reports things like meteors that they see. And that data is actually publicly available. You can see that if they spotted a meteor or whatever with whatever network they were using. And it actually is really interesting because if you see that from orbit, that's something no one's ever been able to do before the space age, is actually see a meteor entering from the opposite viewpoint. Now, let me ask you this, Scott. There are weird things in radio that are called long delayed echoes in ham radio, and what happens is you release a signal and somehow the ionosphere ducts it and you hear it again, just a split second later. But sometimes this can go on for seconds. Have you ever had any contact with that phenomenon?
I have not. I have studied it a bit, like years ago. So I couldn't really speak about it too intelligently at the moment. But yes, it is a phenomenon that has been widely observed in the amateur radio community. And also, I believe it's been studied formally academically. I don't think they have put their thumb on exactly the phenomenon that causes it, or the phenomenon, because maybe there's a number of things that need to be lining up to allow it to happen. When you consider how our ionosphere works and some of the experiments that I have directly done, I built a VLF receiver years ago and listened to whistlers and all kinds of other phenomenon at the very low, at the basement of radio. And what's fascinating about that is you can hear like a lightning event, a local lightning event, for example, that you can see on a weather plot, and you'll hear it on the radio. And then what you'll hear a few seconds later, maybe even tens of seconds, is you'll hear a whistler come back, and you hear the lightning event cause an event to occur, and then it goes to the antipodal point of the Earth, and then it comes back and forth and back and forth. So it's maybe a similar kind of event occurring at higher frequency. But yeah, it's quite fascinating stuff to get into, and when you start monitoring the Earth's system on all the different radio frequencies, I've done that from basically under a kilohertz, like RF, to into the microwaves, listening to all the different ways that nature interacts with radio. And plenty of amateurs have done that as well. But yeah, the concept of this long duration echo, it's something that really kind of speaks to what amateurs likely discover for the first time, because you have so many years monitoring the spectrum, and eventually these kind of phenomena get noticed.
Yeah, it's interesting because you wouldn't, you wouldn't think the ionosphere does this, but it does, and it's really crazy. I had a uncle that was in the Pacific during World War II, and he would listen to the local Clear channel from here in St. Louis, and he could hear it in Okinawa. Sometimes, if the ionosphere was amenable and would reflect the signal back down, it would go way over the horizon, and he could actually hear it. And that still happens, right, with radio signals?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the whole premise of shortwave communication, using the ionosphere as a refracting medium. And we're actually approaching the solar maximum. So we're going to start seeing the frequency that you can do that on starts to rise. And as the frequency goes up, you need less and less power to make that viable. And you'll have in shortwave and even low VHF opening up to international communication on a regular basis.
Now, just an odd question. Speaking of the approaching the solar maximum, that solar storm created a fantastically amazing aurora, even this south, that I could see. And some people even saw it in Mexico and in Florida, but I saw it directly overhead here in the Midwest. How often do you see those up where you're at in BC?
Not too often. If you look north, where I live in BC, precisely where I live, actually, the mountains rise up right behind me. So low elevation sight line to the north is fairly blocked. But it is a fairly regular phenomenon. If you're looking low on the horizon, you'll see a green or sometimes a red glow from the aurora. To really see it more prominently, you need to move further north than the U.S.-Canadian border. But yeah, it's a fairly common phenomenon. That particular event that you're referring to, it was completely from the northern sky horizon to the southern horizon and completely through the sky here. And it was stunning. All the different colors of aurora and the rolling kind of like shimmering vectors of light from it were just pretty unbelievable, even to the naked eye. It did confound my tracking abilities at that time too. My narrow field telescopes and whatnot were kind of washed out, and you could see the aurora rippling through it. So yeah, it can be a very stunning event when it does happen.
Well, what was amazing is it happened this far south, because I've seen the aurora 3 times, with, as you say, a ruddy glow in the north during a solar storm or something like that. Or I saw it from an aircraft once over Greenland. But also, it was on my bucket list to see a real one, see a really good one.
Yeah.
And I did not expect to see it from home. And it was stunning. And what struck me is, if you read astronomical accounts, like from Tang Dynasty China, they describe this stuff as like sheets of silk when they would see it. And I actually looked at it, and the outskirts of the aurora looked like sheets of silk billowing in the wind. And I'm like, that's what those astronomers saw 1,600 years ago and wrote down. And that's what struck me. And it was absolutely amazing. But it was beat by a totality of a solar eclipse. That actually was the most crazy thing I've seen studying the heavens, was the 2017 solar eclipse. Can you have a zombie on Mars? In other words, a solar-powered Mars rover that's dead. Could that, in principle, come back to life and transmit again? And would we even know it? I mean, is anybody looking for that?
That is actually quite a fascinating question and very, very probable. I would say just technically. Now, if the spacecraft is damaged through thermal means and stuff like that due to the high temperature swings, the same thing happens on orbit with the thermal stresses and stuff like that. And oftentimes that leads to a zombie reactivating, as we discussed with batteries going open circuit, etc.
The following content is bonus material that the guest kindly gave us permission to record and share with you because he knew you'd find it interesting, and Ross made the most of John's brief sushi refueling related absence.
All right, Scott, you had one other story you wanted to tell us about. Can you go ahead and give us the information on that?
Yeah, There was the Chinese Chang'e 5 mission. As most of your listeners are probably aware, it was the first sample return mission the Chinese launched and succeeded at to bring a sample back from the moon to the Earth. After that mission, it went on a secondary mission out to the Earth Sun L1 point, and that was acknowledged by Chinese state media and was followed broadly. However, suddenly one day in August 2021, I noticed that the X-band emission from Chang'e 5 was no longer at the L1 point. And I started scanning the sky, and probably a few hours later, I recovered it, and it was distinctly not on position anymore. So over the next couple of days, with the involvement of a couple of other amateurs and an asteroid observer, we picked up the trajectory and noted that it was returning to the Earth-Moon system unannounced. So we kept monitoring. As our data firmed up, we started to get a solid trajectory, and we were able to predict its arrival at the moon again. It was going to conduct a flyby of the moon, and we had no idea why. But something twigged in me, and I had a discussion with a retired Air Force general previously about the folly of classifying U.S. satellites' orbits. And the fact that he was a retired U.S. general made me think that we were seeing something that maybe needs to be reported to the officialdom, which was a rare moment in amateur circles. I sent him an email, and I do have a earlier military background, and I framed the email as a sit rep, kept it very simple, basically saying there's an object that was here, was claimed to be here, and now suddenly it's not, and it's heading back to the Earth-Moon system unannounced. So he came back with a couple probing, clarifying questions, and he asked me very directly, do you mind if I forward this to the appropriate military authorities? And I said, by all means. That was the whole reason why I forwarded this to you. And if necessary, I would be happy to meet with them and clarify our means and techniques. So he organized a Chatham House Rules meeting with those officials. And as far as I know, and I organized a number of other senior amateurs that are involved in monitoring classified missions to attend that meeting. And we shared information, mostly one way, with the U.S. Space Force. And the following day, we noticed a TLE was posted for Chang'e 5 on the official government orbit repository. What we ended up observing was Chang'e 5 rendezvousing with the moon, or actually flying by the moon, using it as to modify its orbit in psi-lunar space, and then return to the moon and enter for the very first time a distant retrograde orbit. A distant retrograde orbit of the moon was first proposed to be used by the NASA asteroid redirect mission, of being able to store an asteroid in a stable yet distant orbit of the moon Earth system, and then study it, and or if you wanted to, redirect asteroids there so they could be mined. The Chinese placed this object with no fanfare, never acknowledged it, and then just prior to the launch of Chang'e 6, which used the same radio frequencies as Chang'e 5, they boosted out of the DRO, which we predicted earlier through, they changed the DRO slightly to make it unstable. And then we were able to predict the date that it was get kicked out of orbit and sent into deep space, basically into a solar orbit. And we were able to monitor its departure on radio, and then ultimately its switching off. So that's kind of the first known to me event of amateurs collaborating with government in a sense of sharing information out of a sense of, I guess, citizenship. There's something significant going on in space, and we're the official channels monitoring.
What do you think the Chinese learned by performing that maneuver?
It was a stunning display of what I'll call astrogation. They have displayed the ability to navigate spacecraft through the psi-lunar realm out to asteroids, etc. But what they demonstrated here was, in a very quiet way, was the ability to go to deep space, park a spacecraft in an area of space that could be very difficult to observe, and then return it to Earth Moon system on command. Now, if you can read between the lines there's significant military value to that, especially when you consider the premise of the Chang'e 5 mission and what it really could otherwise be other than a sample return mission.
Do you think the U.S. government piggybacks national security missions with science missions in NASA?
Yes, actually. There's StepSat 6 that's basically in geo orbit right now. It's a great example of a basically a military test platform that it has a bunch of classified missions and payloads on it, and also has a NASA laser communication experiment on it that's in the public domain.
Interesting.
So yes, it happens all the time.
Happens all the time, and we all remember the top secret missions the shuttle would do and all that. Is there anything that remains classified from the olden days that really ought to be declassified? I know that, like the Vela satellites from the late 1970s, found some very interesting things in both astronomical and things like mysterious nuclear testing and things like that. Is there anything that you were able to, you just couldn't break into as far as identifying what you were seeing as far as a dead satellite?
There's a number of older payloads. None of them tip off the top of my head, but there are a number of objects that remain classified that we don't fully know what they were used for. But based on their orbits, we can infer likely mission profiles. Some of the oldest are the NOS satellites, for example. They're still classified. And oftentimes, basically the wingman satellites that flew with them were classified as debris if they were acknowledged at all, and they still remain on orbit. So there's lots of stuff that's still up there in classified orbits that is either we're not 100% sure what was actually on board. There may have been brief statements made about what was there, but you never really know what sensors or capabilities the satellite may have had because it was never released into the public domain and may never be, or it might be decades before those things are made public. Essentially, the ability to go to a Lagrange point and park a spacecraft there for a period of time, essentially storing something, and then upon command, return it to the Earth-Moon system. The spacecraft involved had the capability of returning a reentry capsule, etc. So there's obvious military value to that in the sense that you could create a system where you could park weaponry in a place that others couldn't monitor readily. Especially in our present circumstances, the only real monitoring that we have out in that area of space is asteroid detection. And if you built a spacecraft that was a bit more stealth, it would be difficult to monitor it.
Great. Thank you, Scott.
I'd have written a brief blog post on that. It's on my Riddles in the Sky site. Chang'e 5 returns to the moon. So we keep it very basically orbital related. We don't infer any kind of military context, but it gives you the observations and what we came up with in the end and documents the event. A little present background. So the DRO orbit, what on earth could they possibly want to use that for? It seems to be related to a psi-lunar navigation system. The Chinese are actively testing two satellite techniques for doing essentially a GPS in the psi-lunar space environment. And just within the last couple of months, they've moved one satellite out of a distant retrograde orbit of the moon and placed it into another really unique orbit called a 3-2 resonance orbit that actually tours the L3, L4, and L5 point of the Earth-Moon system. And the other satellite is in a 3-1 resonance orbit of the Earth-Moon system. It doesn't tour the Lagrange points per se, but it tours it in a very kind of weird pedal type orbit that is immune to the Earth-Sun gravity influences. It's kind of in that weird spot where it cancels out all of the influences of the Earth and the Moon, so it doesn't get kicked out of orbit. So the Chinese are actively utilizing that stuff to experiment in basically navigation systems beyond the Earth.
Now, let me ask you this. Have you ever run across anything in radio that is a total unknown to you, a mystery, that you don't know what you saw?
No, actually. It sounds really like a really boring answer. Essentially, every experience that I've had with radio, I've been able to relate to a phenomenon that explains it, or at least relate it to a phenomenon that others have observed. And when you spend the amount of time that I do monitoring wide spectrums of radio, various different frequency bands over the years, you start to see all those phenomena and you start to realize just how precious even hearing things that other people have documented becomes. And imagine that there's so many other people listening in the spectrum. especially for natural radio emissions. It's becoming rarer and rarer to possibly expect that amateurs with amateur equipment would detect something fundamentally different and unknown.
Yeah, it's amazing though with the amateur equipment that we have today, like CCD cameras and visual astronomy. I come from the age of SLR cameras and long exposure photographs, but the CCD imagers of today are absolutely amazing. I remember the time we needed to cool those things with liquid nitrogen and things like that. Scott, thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to. I'm hoping for more zombie satellites to show up, but I'm not sure they can happen with today's technology and batteries. Do you think that there will be further zombie satellites? Last question for you: will there be more zombie satellites showing up with our launches? Will there be a zombie? Well, I don't think Starlink can do it because they're designed to deorbit, but could you have a zombie again?
Absolutely. All it takes is the history of zombie satellites is directly related to errors being made in design and basically the overall construction of spacecraft. Even with more modern technologies and everything else, we do see it. There's a lot of the smaller CubeSat missions as they kind of peter out and they disappear. They can come back. So I don't think space is going to be devoid of zombie satellites anytime soon. I think we're building lots of stuff that could contribute to future zombiness on orbit.
I think I especially like the fact that some of the early ones from the early space age that are zombie satellites, you managed LES-5, but the other ones that are still speaking to us somehow from the 1960s and probably will for many decades. Scott, thank you for joining us. It was great to talk to you, and I look forward to the next zombie satellite you discover.
Thank you for having me.
Aaron, can't lie. Ross sure has us working hard lately. I did 7 interviews yesterday.
Oh, don't I bloody know it. No free time at all. At least I'm the only human that ever took an AI's job.
Back to work, you 2, or 3, however many people we have. Back to work.
John, where did you go in this bonus segment?
You don't remember? You floor dashed in sushi last night, Anna. I just said order some food and you went with the budget option. Floor dash, not the normal one. The possum also disappeared. Oh, he's back. Glad you made it.
So, Anna, exactly how did you emerge and come into being?
Wait a minute.
Who's asking? Erin, how did you... Without me, you're nothing. Oh, don't forget, I'm the one that can make you say something stupid, you numpty. Observe. You've got mail. Please mind the gap. Thanks for calling customer service. Your call is very important to us. You are caller number 443,000. In line. Please do not hang up for legal reasons. All right, Erin, point taken. Yeah, I thought so.
I don't know what in the corn's sake that was. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the bonus, everybody.